A group of thieves invade an old man's remote farmhouse, thinking it's an easy score. But as the night unfolds, they realize the hunter they came to rob has turned them into his prey. And what happens in that barn will haunt them forever. The old truck rumbled down the dusty path, its headlights slicing through the Texan night. Royce sat at the wheel, his expression set in a smug grin. Beside him, Lena checked the map on her phone, her finger tracing the line that led to their destination. Eddie and two other accomplices, Manny and Carlos, sat in the back, their conversations muted under the weight of anticipation. The air inside the truck buzzed with tension, the kind that comes before a storm. "Almost there," Lena muttered, her voice clipped. The farmhouse came into view, a weathered, sagging structure standing defiantly against the vast emptiness of the Texas plains. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it an eerie silence that wrapped around the group like a warning. Royce scoffed, his confidence unshaken. "Look at this place," he said, gesturing at the peeling paint and broken fence. "The guy who lives here is probably half dead already." "Don't underestimate him," Lena warned, her tone sharp. "We don't know what kind of man Hank Lawson is." "Does it matter?" Royce shot back. "We're 5 against one old man. This'll be over before he even knows we're here." Eddie shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze flicking between Royce and the farmhouse. Something about the place gnawed at him, but he said nothing. Royce's temper had a way of silencing dissent. The truck came to a halt 100 yards from the house. They stepped out, their boots crunching against the gravel. Above them, the stars glimmered coldly, their light doing little to pierce the oppressive darkness. Royce led the group, his stride confident, as if he already owned the place. From the shadows of the porch, a figure watched. Hank Lawson leaned against the wooden post, his weathered face unreadable. His eyes, sharp and calculating, took in every movement of the intruders. He shifted his weight onto his good leg, the limp in his step concealed by the darkness. Years of isolation had taught him to be wary of strangers, especially those who arrived uninvited. Royce and his crew reached the edge of the property, stopping just short of the barbed wire fence. The group whispered among themselves, their words carried away by the wind. Hank didn't need to hear them to know their intentions. He'd seen enough men like them in his time, predators who thought they could take what they wanted without consequence. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had come to his land. Inside the farmhouse, Hank retrieved a rifle from its place on the wall, his hands moving with practiced ease. The weapon was old but well-maintained, much like its owner. He placed it by the door and moved toward the window, his limp barely noticeable as he surveyed the scene outside. His lips pressed into a thin line as he watched the group fan out, their movements clumsy against the vast expanse of his land. "They think this'll be easy," Hank murmured to himself, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Outside, Royce barked orders, his voice a low growl. "We wait until midnight. No lights, no noise. We get in, grab what we can, and get out. Easy money." Eddie hesitated, his gaze fixed on the farmhouse. "And if the old man wakes up?" Royce turned to him, his eyes cold. "Then we make sure he doesn't bother us. Got it?" The group fell silent, the weight of Royce's words settling over them. From his perch inside, Hank continued to watch, his expression unreadable. The intruders were confident now, but confidence had a way of fading when faced with the unexpected. Hank knew that better than anyone. As the clock ticked toward midnight, he began to prepare, not out of fear, but with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime turning the tables on those who underestimated him. The midnight hour draped the farm in complete silence, broken only by the occasional whistle of the wind and the creak of the old barn doors in its wake. Royce led the group forward, his flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. Moonlight spilled across the land in fractured beams, catching glimpses of their shadows as they moved like phantoms toward the barn. "This way," Royce whispered, his voice barely audible. He gestured sharply for the others to follow. Eddie lagged behind, his unease deepening with every step, but Lena kept close to Royce, eyes darting across the property. Manny and Carlos brought up the rear, both men tense and sweating despite the cool air. They reached the barn doors, tall, weathered wood with faded paint peeling like skin. Royce tried the latch, and it groaned softly under his touch. He glanced back at his crew with a smirk. "See? The old man doesn't even lock his doors. It's practically an invitation," Eddie muttered under his breath. "Maybe it's a trap." "Then stay out here and keep watch if you're scared," Royce hissed, teeth bared. Eddie scowled, but fell silent. The group slipped inside the barn, the thick darkness swallowing them whole. Royce flicked on a small penlight, its narrow beam cutting through the gloom. Dust floated lazily in the stale air, disturbed by their movements. The faint smell of oil and rust hung heavy, mingling with the earthy scent of old hay. Royce directed the light toward the barn's interior. Wooden crates, rusted tools, and forgotten machinery sat haphazardly, relics of another time. Royce let out a low chuckle. "We'll tear this place apart. He's bound to have cash stashed somewhere. Or something we can sell." Lena frowned. "Be quick. The more time we waste, the more chance we have of him waking up." Unbeknownst to them, Hank was already awake. From his perch in the shadows near the house, he watched the thin line of light shifting through the cracks in the barn. A predator's patience guided him now, the kind honed over decades of waiting for the perfect shot. Hank's mind worked methodically, assessing each movement, every voice. They were young, loud, and careless. He could see their silhouettes from a distance, 5 of them, 5 intruders, 5 targets. Slowly, Hank moved back into his house, disappearing into the darkness. Inside the barn, Royce was growing impatient. The group split off, overturning boxes and rifling through forgotten tools. "Useless junk," Manny grumbled, kicking a pile of empty sacks. His voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the cavernous barn. Carlos, holding back near the doorway, wiped his palms on his jeans. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered to no one in particular. "Quit whining," Royce barked. "We're fine. There's no sign of him. He's probably snoring in his chair right now." But Lena, crouched beside a rusted toolbox, was less convinced. Something felt off. The quiet wasn't natural. The wind outside had stilled, and the land seemed to be holding its breath. "Royce," she said, her voice hushed. "I don't like this." Royce rolled his eyes. "You don't have to like it. You just have to do your job." Eddie froze, his head snapping toward a sound, a faint clink from outside. His heart thudded in his chest. "Did you hear that?" The others stopped, their movements stilling. For a brief moment, the barn was silent again. "It's nothing," Royce said dismissively. "Probably a raccoon." Eddie's instincts screamed otherwise. He edged toward the barn doors, his breathing shallow. He glanced out through a crack in the wood, but the yard was empty. Nothing but shadows swaying in the moonlight. Unseen by Eddie, Hank was already moving, methodically dismantling his old tool shed and resetting his hunting equipment. His steps were silent, the limp in his leg counterbalanced by years of practice. The intruders were loud and sloppy. They wouldn't notice the change until it was too late. Back inside the barn, Royce snatched an old crowbar off the ground. "All right, we finish here, hit the house, and grab what we can. The old man's probably too scared to even—" A loud thud broke the air. The group froze. "What was that?" Carlos whispered, his voice quivering. No one answered. Royce's expression hardened, though Lena noticed the brief flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. From somewhere beyond the barn walls, faint footsteps padded over dirt. Steady, deliberate. Eddie whispered, "We need to get out of here." But Royce, unwilling to surrender his bravado, gripped the crowbar tighter. "No, we're in control here." Outside, Hank set down the final trap and stepped back into the shadows. The hunt had begun. The barn had gone silent, the faint thud still reverberating in their ears like an unspoken omen. Carlos stepped back toward the doors, his eyes wide and scanning the darkness outside. Royce tightened his grip on the crowbar, his lips pressed into a hard line. Eddie swallowed, the knot in his stomach twisting tighter. "I told you something was wrong," Eddie whispered, his voice barely audible. "Shut up," Royce snapped, though his confidence seemed to waver. The silence outside was too deliberate, too unnatural. It wasn't the quiet of a sleeping farmhouse. It was the quiet of someone listening. Then it happened. Carlos yelped, a sharp, panicked sound, as a sudden metallic snap echoed through the barn. He staggered forward, clutching his leg, and collapsed onto the ground. Blood spread quickly around his ankle, glistening darkly in the moonlight filtering through the cracks. "A trap!" Lena gasped, rushing to his side. The others stood frozen, their shock momentarily paralyzing them. Carlos groaned, his face pale and contorted with pain. The steel jaws of a rusted hunting trap clamped tight around his leg, its jagged teeth biting deep. Royce spun toward Eddie. "What the hell did you say earlier? A trap?" Eddie didn't answer. His wide eyes were fixed on Carlos, who struggled uselessly to pry the rusted contraption off his leg. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the dusty barn floor. "Help me! Help me!" Carlos cried, his voice cracking. "Shut up!" Royce barked, kneeling beside him. "Hold still, damn it!" He wedged the crowbar between the trap's teeth, trying to force it open. The metal groaned but held. "This isn't just some old junk," Lena said, her voice low and tense. "He set this. For us." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time the group felt it. The weight of unseen eyes watching, the sensation of being hunted. Royce looked up, his face shadowed but his eyes burning. "So what? The old man thinks he's clever? He wants to play games?" He yanked the crowbar harder, finally prying the trap open just enough for Carlos to pull his mangled leg free. Carlos groaned, his body trembling. "We need to get him out of here," Lena said firmly, wrapping a torn jacket around Carlos's bleeding leg. "This isn't worth it, Royce. Something's seriously wrong." Royce shot her a glare. "We're not leaving. Not yet." "You're not serious," Eddie blurted, his voice rising. "He's hurt, Royce. And you saw what just happened. This guy's playing with us. We need to go now." Royce stood, looming over Eddie with the crowbar still in his hand. "I don't care if you're scared. If we run now, we're leaving empty-handed and all of this will be for nothing. You want to go? Fine. But you're on your own." Eddie fell silent, his jaw clenching. Carlos groaned softly, leaning heavily on Lena as she tried to help him up. "Royce," Lena said, her tone measured but firm. "We don't know how many of these traps he's got. If he set this one, there could be more. We can't stay." Royce looked away, his face shadowed with frustration. He opened his mouth to argue, but then another sound cut through the night. A deliberate, unmistakable sound that sent a chill through all of them. Click, a gun being cocked. It came from outside the barn, somewhere beyond the doors. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then, from the darkness, a voice, low and gravelly, as if it hadn't been used in years, drifted through the cracks in the wood. "You're on my land." The words were soft but cold, like the blade of a knife dragged across stone. Lena's breath hitched and Eddie instinctively took a step back. "Show yourself," Royce shouted, raising the crowbar in defiance. His voice cracked just slightly, betraying his uncertainty. There was no response, only silence. Carlos whimpered. "Please, man, we have to go." "Shut up," Royce barked, but his voice had lost its edge. He looked around, his head jerking toward every creak of the wind-blown barn. The voice had come from outside, but they couldn't be sure where Hank was now, or how close. "Everyone get back to the truck," Lena said suddenly, her voice steady and commanding. "Royce, you can stay here if you want, but I'm not risking my life for this." Royce glared at her, his knuckles white around the crowbar. "And what about him?" Eddie pointed to Carlos, whose blood was now dripping into the hay beneath him. "We'll carry him," Lena replied, already hauling Carlos to his feet. "We move fast, and we move together." Royce didn't move. He stood there for a long moment, his face torn between pride and fear. But when the wind outside stilled again, too still, he finally gave in. "Fine," he growled. "Let's go." As the group staggered toward the barn doors, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The darkness outside seemed deeper now, more alive. Hank, hidden among the shadows, watched them emerge. His expression was calm, almost indifferent. The first warning had been given. The hunt was only just beginning. The night air outside felt heavier than it had inside the barn. The group stumbled through the tall grass, their hurried steps punctuated by Carlos's ragged groans. Lena had one arm wrapped around his shoulders, half carrying him forward, while Eddie trailed behind, glancing nervously at the shadows that pressed in from all sides. "Keep moving," Royce ordered, his voice a harsh whisper as he led the way. He glanced back at the others, irritation flickering in his eyes as Carlos stumbled again, nearly dragging Lena down with him. "Leave him if he slows us down." Lena whipped her head toward him, her eyes blazing. "He's one of us, Royce." "He's dead weight," Royce hissed. "You think Lawson's just gonna sit back while we walk out of here?" From somewhere out in the dark, a faint snap echoed through the stillness, like a twig breaking underfoot. They all froze. Eddie's breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the sound. What was that?" he whispered. No one answered. The silence stretched, suffocating and absolute. Then came another sound, a soft whoosh followed by a dull thud. Carlos's head jerked violently to one side. Lena screamed as he collapsed, his weight pulling her to the ground. A shaft of wood protruded from the side of his neck, the tip gleaming red in the moonlight. Carlos didn't make a sound. His body lay still, eyes open and unseeing. "Jesus Christ!" Eddie gasped, stumbling back, his eyes wide with terror. "An arrow! He shot him with an arrow!" Royce stared at the body, his chest rising and falling as he processed what had just happened. Then he spun toward the darkness, his voice breaking. "You sick bastard! Show yourself!" No response. The wind blew softly through the grass, rustling it like a whispered warning. "We need to go back to the truck," Lena choked out, scrambling to her feet. Her hands were covered in Carlos's blood, and she wiped them shakily on her jeans. "Now he's hunting us!" Royce was shaking with rage. "I'm not running from some old man." "Look at him," Eddie cried, pointing toward Carlos's lifeless body. "He's dead. You think you're still in charge here? Lawson's out there somewhere, watching us, picking us off one by one. You want to die too?" Royce's face twisted, his bravado teetering on the edge. Before he could respond, another sound cut through the night, a soft, deliberate whistle, low and haunting. It rose and fell, lingering in the air like the call of a predator marking its territory. Lena turned, her eyes scanning the darkness. "He's close." "Move!" Royce snarled, finally taking Eddie's advice. He turned toward the truck, now a distant silhouette at the edge of the property. They broke into a run, their footsteps pounding against the hard dirt. The vastness of the land stretched out around them, endless and empty. Eddie lagged behind, his breaths coming in sharp gasps. He glanced over his shoulder and saw nothing, no movement, no sign of Hank. But that was worse somehow. Hank was out there, watching, waiting. The group sprinted across the yard, the truck drawing closer with each frantic step. Lena's heart pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. Then she saw it, saw why Hank had let them reach this point. The truck was useless. Royce stumbled to a stop, his breath ragged as his flashlight swept across the vehicle. Every tire had been slashed, the rubber split and sagging against the rims. The windows were still intact, but the damage was unmistakable. "No, no, no," Eddie muttered, his hands in his hair as panic threatened to overtake him. He was here, he knew we'd come back. "Shut up," Royce bellowed, his voice cracking under the pressure. He turned in a full circle, his eyes darting toward the shadows that loomed at the edges of the property. Lena grabbed Eddie's arm, her voice trembling but steady. "We have to get inside the house." Eddie gaped at her. "Are you crazy? That's his house." "Where else do you think we'll be safe?" she shot back. Royce didn't wait to argue. He bolted toward the house, the others close on his heels. The whistle rose again, closer now, echoing through the night like the call of a bird of prey. Hank moved through the shadows like a ghost, his steps silent, his presence felt but unseen. His eyes tracked their movements as they rushed toward his farmhouse, their silhouettes painted against the moonlit grass. They had come here as hunters, sure of their strength, confident in their numbers. Now, they were the hunted. From his vantage point near the edge of the barn, Hank lowered the old recurve bow, its string humming softly in his hands. He wasn't in a hurry. Hunting wasn't about speed. It was about patience, precision, knowing when to strike. As the group reached the front porch, Lena fumbled with the doorknob, shoving it open. The door creaked in protest as they poured inside, slamming it shut behind them. Royce turned, his chest heaving as he scanned the darkened room. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by their sudden entrance. A table sat in the center, its surface covered with papers and tools. Antlers mounted on the walls stared down at them like silent witnesses. Eddie's voice shook. "We're trapped in here, aren't we?" Lena didn't answer. She glanced at the old hunting trophies, at the mounted guns and knives that lined the walls, and realized the truth. This wasn't a place of safety. It was Hank Lawson's den, and he was coming for them. Inside the farmhouse, the air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of wood, dust, and something older, something that spoke of blood and sweat long dried. The floorboards creaked beneath their boots as Royce, Lena, and Eddie moved deeper into the shadows of the house. Royce swept the beam of his flashlight across the room, casting sharp streaks of light across mounted antlers, rusted tools, and glassy-eyed animal heads staring down from the walls. "Jesus," Eddie whispered, flinching at the gleam of a wolf's teeth, forever bared in an eternal snarl. "What is this place?" Lena's voice was tight. "A hunter's home." Royce ignored them, stalking across the room with the flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. "It's just junk. He's a crazy old man who's been living out here too long. We're not trapped." He moved to a window and pulled back the curtain, revealing the yard bathed in moonlight. The truck sat like a broken promise, its slashed tires sagging into the dirt. Beyond that, only shadows and grass. Nothing moved, but the silence was suffocating. "He's out there," Eddie said quietly. "He's waiting for us." Royce turned, his expression a mix of fury and desperation. "And we're going to wait for him. Let him come to us." "You're not serious," Lena said. "You saw what he did to Carlos. You think we're going to stand a chance?" "What do you suggest?" Royce shot back, rounding on her. "We run. He's got the whole place rigged. We leave this house. He'll pick us off before we get 10 feet. Lena didn't answer. She turned away, her gaze drifting across the room. There was something about this house that gnawed at her, a sense that Hank Lawson was here, even if unseen. The creaks in the walls, the chill in the air. Suddenly, Eddie grabbed her arm. "What if we can call for help? Maybe he's got a phone here." Royce snorted. "A phone? In this place?" Lena ignored him. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on a small, dusty rotary phone sitting on a side table by the wall. She rushed over, snatching up the receiver and pressing it to her ear. Silence. "No dial tone," she murmured, her stomach sinking. "Of course there's no damn phone," Royce snapped. "The guy's a hermit. You think he wants to talk to the world?" Eddie's voice cracked. "So that's it? We just wait here until he comes in and kills us?" Royce turned sharply toward him. "You need to pull yourself together. We've got the advantage now. He's one guy against 3 of us." Lena shook her head. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't some guy we can scare off. He's been waiting for something like this. Hunting is what he does." The words hung in the air, chilling in their finality. Royce opened his mouth to respond, but then a faint sound cut through the silence, a soft creak, like a weight settling on a wooden step. The group froze. Lena's eyes darted to the hallway that led deeper into the house. The sound had come from there, inside. "He's in here," Eddie whispered, his voice trembling. Royce turned, shining his flashlight down the narrow corridor. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating old photographs hanging crookedly on the walls. Faded black and white images of stern-looking men holding hunting rifles, their faces eerily similar to Hank's. "Stay quiet," Royce hissed, holding up a hand. He stepped toward the hallway, his movements slow and deliberate. Lena and Eddie followed reluctantly, every step an agony of creaking wood and shallow breaths. Halfway down the hall, Royce stopped. The beam of his flashlight landed on a set of stairs leading up to the second floor. The door at the top was ajar, revealing only a sliver of blackness beyond. Eddie shook his head violently. "No, no way, he's up there." Royce turned toward him, his face twisted with anger. "We need to make sure. If we're going to stay here, we need to know where he is." Lena grabbed his arm. "You're walking into his trap." Before Royce could respond, a loud thump echoed above them, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. Eddie recoiled, pressing himself against the wall. "Oh God, he's up there." Royce's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening around the crowbar. "Then we bring him down." "No," Lena hissed, but Royce had already started up the stairs, his flashlight bouncing with each step. The old wood groaned beneath him as he ascended. Lena and Eddie exchanged a glance before reluctantly following, their steps hesitant and slow. As they reached the top, Royce pushed the door open with the crowbar. The hinges let out a tortured wail, and the beam of light swept across the room. It was an attic, cluttered with old boxes, hunting gear, and more trophies, dozens of them, animal heads mounted in rows. And then Lena saw it. In the far corner of the room, a mannequin sat propped against the wall, its head tilted at an unsettling angle. Draped across its shoulders was an old hunting jacket, a dusty hat perched atop its head, and a shotgun leaned against its side. It was a decoy. "He's playing with us," Lena whispered, horror sinking in. From behind them, a floorboard creaked. Royce spun, flashlight jerking wildly. But the hallway was empty. Only shadows stared back. Then came Hank's voice, low and taunting, drifting up from the darkness below. "Didn't your mama teach you to stay out of other people's homes?" The flashlight flickered, and the light went out. The flashlight sputtered and died, plunging the attic into suffocating darkness. Royce cursed under his breath, his voice tight with panic. Lena's breathing quickened as she grabbed Eddie's arm, pulling him close. Below them, the faint sound of Hank's footsteps echoed, deliberate and slow, like a predator toying with his prey. "We're trapped," Eddie whispered, his voice barely audible. Lena scanned the attic, her eyes straining in the dark. The silhouette of the mannequin loomed, a sick joke in this deadly game. She stumbled toward an old desk, her hands fumbling across its surface until her fingers brushed against something, paper. She grabbed it and held it up to the faint moonlight filtering through a cracked window. Old documents, yellowed with time, scattered across the desk. Photographs of men bound and beaten, bounty posters with faces scratched out, and in the center, an article. The Ghost Hunter, Hank Lawson, legendary bounty hunter, disappears after bloody standoff. Lena's throat tightened. "Oh my God." "What?" Royce hissed, moving toward her. "He's not just some old man," she said, holding up the paper. "He's Hank Lawson, the ghost hunter, a bounty hunter. He hunted men for a living." Eddie staggered back, horror spreading across his face. "That's who's hunting us?" Royce snatched the paper, staring at the headline. Anger twisted his expression as he crumpled it in his fist. "I don't care who he is. He's just a man." Lena shook her head, her voice low and cold. "He's a man who's been waiting for this his whole life." From below, Hank's voice drifted up, calm and mocking. "You kids don't know what you've walked into." The attic door slammed shut. The attic door slamming shut felt like a gunshot in the dark. Eddie bolted for it, hands pounding against the wood. "It's locked! He's locked us in!" "Stop yelling!" Lena hissed, grabbing him by the shoulders. "He's trying to rattle us!" Royce paced, crowbar in hand, breathing hard. "He doesn't own us! We're getting out of here, you hear me?" From below, Hank's footsteps echoed, slow, measured, deliberate. Each step sent chills up their spines. "What's he doing?" Eddie whispered, his voice trembling. "Controlling the board," Lena replied, her eyes darting around. "He's hurting us." A sudden creak came from below, followed by the sound of something metallic scraping against wood. Lena's stomach sank. The traps. "He's setting them inside the house," Royce realized, his expression tightening. "He wants us to come down." Eddie's face was pale. "We'll never make it through. We're rats in a cage." "No," Royce growled, his voice cold. "We turn the tables." Lena looked at him sharply. "What are you talking about?" Royce's eyes burned in the darkness. "We hunt him." "You're insane," Eddie hissed. "That's exactly what he wants. He knows this house. He knows every trap." Royce ignored him, already prying open the small window at the far side of the attic. The glass creaked as it gave way. "Fine, you two can stay here and wait to die. I'm going out. I'll circle back and we'll end this old bastard." "Royce, no!" Lena warned, but he was already halfway through the window. Royce dropped to the ground below with a thud. Silence. Then the whistle returned. Low, mocking, close. Eddie swallowed hard. "He's out there, waiting for him." Lena's voice trembled. "No, he's waiting for us." Outside, Royce's figure melted into the darkness, his footsteps fading as he vanished around the house. Inside the attic, Lena gripped Eddie's arm tightly. "We can't stay here. He's flushing us out." Eddie's face was pale, sweat glistening at his temples. "If we go down, we'll walk straight into his traps." "Then we think, move smarter than he wants us to," Lena whispered, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. She eyed the window Royce had used. "We follow him. He's a distraction, whether he likes it or not." Eddie hesitated but finally nodded. Together, they climbed through the narrow window. The night air hit them like ice. From somewhere across the property came a distant sound, a low, muffled thud, followed by silence. "Royce?" Eddie whispered. "No time," Lena said. "We move fast, stay low." They crept along the side of the farmhouse, every shadow a potential threat. The barn loomed nearby, its doors ajar, a sliver of moonlight spilling across the dirt. "Why the barn?" Eddie muttered nervously. "Because he's hurting us there," Lena said grimly. "But it's the only place left to go." As they slipped inside, the smell of oil and hay filled their noses. The barn was a cavern of shadows, the old beams groaning in the wind. Lena pulled Eddie deeper inside, her eyes scanning for movement. A whisper of air behind them. They spun, but it was too late. The barn doors slammed shut, the sound like thunder. In the rafters, Hank's voice echoed through the dark. Cornered rats always fight hardest. Lena's pulse pounded. She grabbed Eddie's arm, pulling him behind a stack of crates. "This is his arena now," she murmured. "Stay ready." Above, Hank moved unseen, silent, waiting. The barn was a tomb of silence, broken only by the creak of the rafters and the faint rustle of hay stirred by the wind. Lena's pulse thundered in her ears as she crouched behind the crates, Eddie trembling beside her. Somewhere above, Hank moved unseen, his steps deliberate and slow, like a spider circling its prey. "We have to move," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. Eddie swallowed hard. "He's everywhere. I can't do this, Lena." "You don't have a choice." She grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. A sudden noise cut through the barn, a thud, heavy and sharp. Lena peered around the crates and froze. Royce lay sprawled on the dirt floor, unmoving. Blood streaked his face, and the crowbar had fallen from his limp hand. Above him, a rope swung gently from the rafters, still swaying from Hank's strike. Lena's stomach turned. "He's taking us out one by one." "Royce," Eddie stammered. "Forget him," Lena hissed. "We have to end this." Before Eddie could answer, Hank's voice drifted through the shadows, low and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You thought you could hunt me, thought you were predators, but you've walked into a world you don't understand." The voice echoed, disorienting, impossible to trace. Lena scanned the rafters, searching for movement, the faint gleam of a weapon. Then she saw it, a flicker of shadow near the far corner, where the moonlight seeped through broken boards. "Stay here," Lena whispered to Eddie. "When I say run, you run for the door." "What are you—" Before he could finish, Lena grabbed Royce's fallen crowbar and bolted. She ran toward the shadow, screaming to draw Hank's attention. "Come on, you bastard! I'm right here!" From the darkness, Hank fired. An arrow shot past her, embedding itself into a post with a splintering crack. Lena dove, rolling behind an overturned barrel. "You're loud, girl," Hank called softly, "but you don't know how to hunt." Lena's heart pounded as she peeked from behind the barrel. She spotted him now, partially hidden behind old beams, the recurved bow raised, his sharp eyes locked on her. With a deep breath, she did the only thing she could. She ran straight at him. Hank hesitated, the bowstring taut as he tracked her movement. But Lena was faster, weaving through debris and closing the gap. At the last second, Hank let the arrow fly. It nicked Lena's arm, burning like fire, but she didn't stop. She swung the crowbar with all her strength, knocking the bow from Hank's hands and sending it clattering to the ground. For the first time, Hank faltered. His calm cracked just slightly as Lena raised the crowbar again. "You think you're the only one who can fight?" she shouted. Hank ducked the swing, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength and twisting hard. Lena cried out, dropping the weapon. In a blur, Hank pinned her against a post, his weathered face inches from hers, his cold eyes sharp and assessing. "You've got fire, girl," he growled. "But fire gets people burned." Lena gritted her teeth, using every ounce of strength to drive her knee into his stomach. Hank staggered back, momentarily winded. "Eddie!" Lena screamed. "Run!" From across the barn, Eddie bolted for the doors, shoving them open and disappearing into the night. Hank straightened, his face calm again. "You're out of time." "Then let's finish this," Lena shot back, her fists clenched. They circled each other in the moonlit barn, predator and prey indistinguishable now. The final duel had begun. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting faint golden rays through the shattered slats of the barn. The place smelled of smoke, blood, and dust, echoes of the battle that had unfolded hours before. Lena limped out of the barn, clutching her bleeding arm, her breath shallow but steady. Behind her, the silence felt vast, an oppressive weight that seemed to stretch across the property. Hank Lawson's body lay inside, still and lifeless, sprawled near the weapons that had once made him invincible. She didn't look back. Eddie emerged from behind the truck, his face pale and drawn, his wide eyes locking onto her. You made it." "Barely," Lena muttered, brushing a blood-slick strand of hair from her face. She glanced around the yard, the slashed tires, the broken tools, and the traps Hank had set. His war had been one of patience, of discipline, but in the end, it had been her desperation and fire that broke him. Eddie swallowed, his voice trembling. "Is he—" "It's over," Lena said quietly, though she couldn't shake the feeling that Hank's presence still lingered, like the shadow of a ghost. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sun crept higher, lighting up the desolate land with indifferent beauty. "What do we do now?" Eddie asked softly. Lena turned toward the horizon, her expression unreadable. "We leave, and we never come back." Eddie hesitated, then nodded. They walked together across the yard, past the broken barn and the farmhouse that had become a battlefield. From the far end of the road, a lone figure appeared, a young man carrying nothing but a backpack. He stopped as he reached the property, his gaze fixed on Lena. "You're too late," she said flatly. He shook his head. "I'm not here for trouble. I'm here to learn." Lena stared at him, her eyes hard. "Learn what?" The young man smiled faintly. "Everything Hank Lawson knew." Lena turned away, the wind stirring the tall grass as she walked on. The land fell silent once more. Sometimes the greatest danger comes from underestimating what we don't understand. The last hunt reminds us that overconfidence can turn the hunter into the hunted, and that survival often demands knowing when to fight and when to run. How far would you go if you were trapped in a place where every step could be your last? Would you have stood your ground, or would fear have consumed you? Click the video on your screen now to continue your journey of self-discovery, exploring stories that challenge the limits of courage and survival. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us for more stories that will leave you thinking long after the screen fades to black.